So the people in this room, we polled them before you got here, and by 2 to 1, they do not expect a deal before we hit the fiscal cliff. That's my name and your name, so no one else. You're okay. No more information. Although there is a bit of a highlighting of the Dominican Republic, which we haven't figured out what that's all about. I think there's a lot of anxiety in this room about the fiscal cliff. Do you think that we're going to go over the cliff, or are you confident that your side can get a deal with the other side before we get there?
I think we'll have to see, but I think there's every reason to believe this is a solvable problem. It's true that we have a lot of challenges as a country, but I think there's a lot of support for trying to do things that'll help make the economy stronger in the short term. There's obviously universal support for extending the middle class tax cuts. Doing that would remove the greatest source of anxiety and much of the greatest risk in the fiscal cliff. And I think there's a lot of support for finding bipartisan consensus on other things that would make the economy stronger, like a set of commitments to finance a higher level of public investments in infrastructure and education. A lot of bipartisan support for that. I think there's a lot of support for doing the obvious things you have to do. You have to pass an extension patch of the AMT and a set of business extensions. Those things are very important to do. And again, I think if you listen carefully, there's a lot of support for trying to make some real progress on our long-term fiscal challenges. A lot of benefit in doing that for the economy. How you do it's very important. So I think this is a solvable problem, and we want to do as much as we can to take advantage of this opportunity to make some progress on each of those fronts.
There's one thing about which there does not appear to be a lot of agreement. That is, should the Bush tax cuts on the over 250,000 crowd be extended, or should taxes be raised on them? I heard Jay Carney just an hour or so ago say that there's no way the president will agree to anything that extends the tax cuts on the upper two brackets. That sounds like a line in the sand, is it?
Well, I do think it's important to start by acknowledging, and we find this encouraging, that you've seen the Republican leaders in the last couple of days explicitly embrace the recognition that and support for, as part of a balanced set of fiscal reforms, a package of changes that raise revenues. That's very, very important. That's very encouraging. It recognizes the basic reality of how you govern a country like this in the face of all the challenges we face. So I think that's good and useful. You know the president's position. The president's position is very simple. Let's extend the middle-class tax cuts, again, removing probably the greatest source of potential uncertainty and damage from the fiscal cliff. Let's put in place a balanced set of fiscal reforms that recognize the reality that Republicans have now embraced, that the most fortunate 2% of Americans are going to have to pay a modestly larger share of income in taxes, but he's not prepared to extend the upper income tax cuts. And let me explain why that's the case. I think if you look at these questions carefully and thoughtfully, of course, as we have done and many other people have done, if you look at the amount of deficit reduction you have to put in place over the next 10 years, if you recognize what's a realistic share of revenues are going to have to contribute to that, and if you believe, as the president does, that we shouldn't be asking middle-class Americans to pay more in taxes, then I don't see how you do this without higher rates. Just don't think there's any feasible, realistic way to do it.
So it's not possible to raise money from upper-income people by closing loopholes, getting rid of deductions, limiting credits, and stuff like that?
Well, what we've proposed is, as part of a balanced fiscal reform package, is a package that would raise roughly another $1.5 trillion in revenues. That's about 1% of GDP. Just to put it in perspective, it's 1% of GDP. And to do that with a mix of modest rate increases, just back to the Clinton rates, which was a very good economy very good time for the American economy, the American business sector, very good time for private investment, very good time for productivity growth. And to combine those with reforms that limit the value of deductions for upper income Americans. Now, it's true there are other ways to do that, but there's a lot of magical thinking about how much money you can raise from tax expenditures. A lot of people who have looked at that question and concluded, I think, incorrectly, that there's a huge amount of resources there you can realistically raise, and I think that's just not true. So again, when I think people look at this and look at it carefully, they'll come to the judgment we reached, which is to do enough to restore fiscal sustainability, to be careful what you do to the long-term growth prospects of the country, and to make sure we're not adding to the burden on middle-class Americans, you're going to have to do so with higher rates, with a mix of rates and deductions. I think that's just a realistic consensus, and I think that's what the political consensus ultimately will join. That's how we'll solve this.
Well, but are you saying that if the Republicans don't agree to raise the top rates back to where they were when Bill Clinton left office, we're going over the fiscal cliff?
Well, again, I don't see a realistic way to solve this without a recognition from Republicans. And, let's just do the positive side. Again, I think it's very encouraging that you've seen the leadership just in these last couple of days recognize that we're going to have to generate a modest amount of additional revenues from high-income Americans. I think that's a good recognition. But, and we're just at the beginning. We're going to get people. The president's going to meet with the leaders at the end of this week, and we'll see how that goes. I agree. I agree. This is going to be tough. I know that the lack of clarity on resolution is going to be a burden, a source of some uncertainty. But I think it's something we have to go through. Because I think if we're going to govern this country better, if we're going to find a better way to make sure we're supporting things that will improve the long-term growth prospects of the country, we have to figure out a way to resolve the current divide on these basic questions about the long-term fiscal trajectory of the country. And that's worth trying to do.
Well, as you have said, and the president has said, that we have to both raise taxes and restrain spending. The president's proposals so far on Medicare have been largely limited to the provider side. Is the president going to lead here with a proposal to do something different on Medicare in order to get the Republicans to back off their position on the top rates?
Well, the president's put in his budget, and I don't think enough attention has been given to this, hundreds of billions of dollars in carefully designed reforms to the healthcare system that are designed to reduce the rate of growth and costs. Now, we recognize there's other ways to do that, but there are hundreds of billions of dollars in detailed, specified policy reforms in that context, and I think those reforms are going to get a careful look now that we have the election behind us. Now, in addition to that, he's proposed hundreds of billions of dollars, too, in other savings in what's called the other parts of the government, other mandatory things like that. And now people can design those things differently, different ways to do it, and he's prepared to look at those things. But we're going to start where we've been, which is with the pretty well-designed set of reforms we've laid out.
Right, but if all the president does is say, I put out my budget, here it is, I won the election, take it or leave it, is that the negotiation?
No, that's not the way he said it. And, he's very careful in the language he said on Friday, and that's not what I'm saying either. I'm just saying that take another look at what we propose, because they're very substantial in their magnitude of savings you get. I mean, just as one point of comparison, they're larger in the 10-year window than the healthcare savings proposed by Simpson-Bowles. So take a careful look at those. We're going to take a careful look at everything, too.
So what happens if we go over the cliff? What happens if the Republicans can't bring themselves to raise the top rates and to accept what you're offering?
Again, I don't see why, I can't speak for them. I don't see why they would make that choice. I mean, why would you want to put the economy through that? Because particularly after conceding a recognition that revenues are going to have to go up, and after conceding a recognition that revenues are going to have to go up on the most fortunate Americans, why would you decide to take the economy over the cliff and put the economy through the damage that's going to cause because you are unwilling to agree to a modest increase on rates for 2% of Americans? It seems deeply implausible as a strategy, and it should be avoidable.
Well, why aren't you willing to say, in order to avoid the economy going over the cliff, we're willing to entertain a different way to get money out of the top 2% that might involve some rather radical restructuring of all the deductions, exclusions, and credit?
Because I think, again, when you take a cold, hard look at the amount of resources you can raise from that top 2% of Americans through limiting deductions, you will find yourself disappointed relative to the magnitude of the revenue increases that we need. Remember, we're looking for 1% of GDP. It's not enormous, but it's still consequential. And you're going to find it's very hard to do that through deductions unless you want to go raise taxes quite meaningfully on middle-class Americans. Now, I know there may be people who argue that's a good policy. That's not the president's view. But even if you think it's good policy, do you think it's more politically realistic? Do you think it's more politically realistic to get a deal that's going to involve some tough things on all aspects of government, how much you spend, by saying, no, instead of a modest tax increase limited to 2% of Americans, we're going to have a much broader tax increase spread across a much broader range of Americans? Is that more politically feasible in this context? And remember, in any framework that restores fiscal responsibility, you're going to be asking pretty significant sacrifices of the broad swath of Americans. Everything that happens on the spending side affects people much more broadly in this context. And what the President proposes is an agreement that has a ratio roughly, if you include the changes we legislated last year, roughly $2.50 of spending cuts for every dollar in revenue. And when you think about those spending cuts, remember, those spending cuts will cut significantly into basic functions of government transfers that affect millions and millions of Americans. So that's why, it's that recognition why we think the shape of balance is going to have to involve that mix of rates and reforms.
I feel like I'm watching the same play with the same actors I watched last year. John Boehner's still in the House. For the time being, you're still at the Treasury. The President's back in the White House. Harry Reid is in the Senate with a few more seats. Why should I believe this will end any more positively than the summer of 2011?
Because, well, again, I'm not going to try and talk you into optimism, but again, let's look at what's changed. You have Republican leadership acknowledging, for the first time in this debate, in public, that they're prepared to agree to increase in revenues as part of an agreement that helps restore fiscal balance. That's a very important change. You can debate about what's motivated that change, and of course, it's true that that approach has very popular, very substantial support among the American people. You have a much greater recognition, I think, that the economy would benefit from a carefully designed, balanced agreement on fiscal reform. And putting that off indefinitely is not good for the country. That's important, too. And I also think if you listen carefully to what people in the business media are saying and what many politicians are saying, many elected representatives are saying, there's a lot of consensus on a set of things that would be good for the economy now. Again, extend the middle-class tax cuts. That's 98% of Americans, tax certainty. Agree to fund a carefully designed long-term program of larger public investments in infrastructure. That's very good for growth. Make sure we're doing sensible things in education so that we're educating a future Americans with a better capacity to compete in this world. Those are things with broad bipartisan support, and they will provide the basic anchor dimension for an agreement.
If we do go over the cliff, at some point you're going to need the Congress to raise the debt ceiling again. And so it seems to me the President's leverage is all up to the end of the year. If you fail to get a deal and you say, fine, we're going to let all the taxes go up, and the President will go on TV and say, I tried, the Republicans were obstinate, then doesn't the leverage shift to them because you need the debt ceiling, and the President has said, and you've said, not raising the debt ceiling is unthinkable?
I don't think so, because, again, I think anybody who looks at the experience of the cost to the country of the strategy those Republicans employed last year would find that an experience they did not want to repeat. And again, I think that our position is a very simple position, which is you don't put the credit of the United States at risk ever. You can't threaten to default on the credit, to destroy the credit of the country as part of some game to get marginal advantage on some policy question. Never been judged a responsible way to govern by any of our predecessors, Republican or Democrat. So my view is that the people were part of that, and they're still there. We'll draw the right lesson from that experience and do what only Congress can do, which is to pass a debt ceiling in a timely manner. They'll do that with less drama than they imposed in the country last time.
And
it wasn't just drama. Again, you guys lived through this. It was enormously costly and damaging.
And what's your role going to be in this next act of the long-running fiscal drama? Are you going to stick around till they get a deal, or?
I'm going to play a very valuable, important role until around the inauguration.
I see, until around the inauguration. All right, let me ask you a couple of questions about the rest of the world, and then we'll get to the questions from the audience, which will all be about the fiscal cliff. How would you evaluate the state of play in Europe now?
Well, I think what the Europeans have done over the last several months is very important. It puts them in a much better position to more carefully manage the incredible difficulty of the reforms that are still ahead for those countries. And the changes to the way Europe is governed and run on the financial sector and fiscal policies are still in prospect. Under, even with the most compelling amount of political will and the greatest degree of agreement, those are going to be very difficult reforms are going to take some time. And what they've done over the last several months is to give them a framework that makes that possible. But they still have a lot of tough decisions ahead. And what I'm referring to in this case is, of course, the combination of the firewalls that the government's agreed to and what the central bank has foreshadowed.
But over the next few months, if there's this question about whether Spain will need a bailout, whether Spain will ask for a bailout, whether Germany will approve a Spanish bailout. If they don't, then all the ECB offers are basically useless. You told us a few months ago that you thought the odds of a catastrophe in Europe had diminished to the part where they were manageable. But they seem to me to be rising again. You don't think so?
Well, again, you're going to see, and I think this is going to be true for years, you're going to see a lot of uncertainty about the precise contours of each of these additional steps. In Greece, over time, any other country that gets itself in a position where it's hard for them to borrow at sustainable rates, and those things are going to be difficult and consequential and a source of anxiety, uncertainty. But by, I think, much more credibly committing as leaders of Europe to take out the risk of catastrophic failure from the equation, from the markets, they've bought themselves some space to do that without there being that much damage on the rest of the world in this context. I think that's very valuable. Of course, again, they have to demonstrate they're willing to do those things, but I think they're in a much better position to do that. And I feel that way even with the events of the last few weeks. I don't think it's surprising that Greece is still hard. And the Greek government has done enormously difficult things over these last few weeks, very, very tough reforms. And I think those reforms will be rewarded by more support from the Europeans. And, you're going to see a little uncertainty about other aspects of this stuff, but I think they're in a much better position than they were, even recognizing the challenges they have ahead.
So what is it that Europe needs to do in the next 2 to 3 months?
They have to just be able to demonstrate that they're moving to put in place economic reforms that make them more competitive, reforms to the way the financial system of Europe is governed, something closer to banking union like they described, and a better mix of constraints on the ability of countries to borrow in the future. Those are the key things they got to make progress on. And that's going to take a incredibly difficult, complicated amount of political negotiation over the next several years.
And China. So will the new leadership in China, once they're established, what will be the things that you'll be watching for? What are the clues we'll get as to the direction they'll take?
I think the big question still is what's going to be the shape of this next generation of economic reforms in China. Again, they've had a remarkable record over the last 30 years of broadening the scope for property rights, broadening the scope for private enterprise, managing a really remarkable increase in incomes, broadly spread growth across that economy. But they've got a really difficult set of challenges ahead as the population ages and they run out of room to use those past forms of stimulus to get the economy moving in the short term. So you're going to be looking carefully to what they do to the way the financial system works. Again, to expand the scope for private investment, private initiative, better property rights, not just for us, but for Chinese innovators, to expand opportunities and incentives for consumption, to reduce the role of state-owned enterprises. Those are things where people are going to look to the Chinese government and see what's the new direction coming forward now. But all indications that we have are that the people that are going to be at the center of that government going forward are very much committed to that path. They're not debating that basic trajectory, but they're going to have to make some decisions about the shape of those reforms. And I think even as recently as last spring, despite the fact they were in the midst of a political transition, they were setting out new frontiers on financial reform that I think were very encouraging. And of course, you've seen again the Chinese exchange rate appreciate really quite significantly over the past few years, in real terms really quite significantly, and they've got some more work to do in that side, but that's part of a commitment towards a more market-oriented economy.
And what about their attitude towards their relationship with us? Is it clear what kind of relationship they want with us?
I think they recognize how important it is for them to have a stable, expanding global economy, and how important it is to them to still enjoy access to the major markets on relatively favorable terms. And it's because of that recognition that they are have been willing to move on a range of things that are very hard for us, but are very important to our commercial and economic interests. And I think that basic balance is going to hold going forward.